the devastating chaos of World War II, where human life seemed to become a disposable commodity and violence spread without bounds, stories emerged that defied the logic of war. One of them is about two German pilots whose unimaginable actions shed light on humanity in the midst of the darkness of a global conflict. It is December 1944, and the world is immersed in a bloody and relentless conflict. The European continent, ravaged by the destruction of war, is on the brink of total collapse. In the skies, fighter planes tear through the air, their machine guns firing relentlessly, while the sound of explosions and combat engines echoes like a sentence of impending death. In this landscape of terror and destruction, the men piloting these war machines are far from being mere soldiers. They are human beings, like any other, facing their own dilemmas and anguish. In a moment of extreme violence, where kindness seemed to be a rarity, a simple act of mercy could, suddenly and unexpectedly, change the fate of entire lives. Over the skies of Belgium, an American pilot, Lieutenant Ed Catrell, finds himself in a desperate situation. His plane, the Armeri, is hit while he tries to execute a strategic bombing mission. He finds himself alone, at the mercy of enemy fighters that surround him. War, in all its brutality, could have been the end for Ed, as it was for so many others. But in that moment, when everything seemed lost, two German pilots made a decision that defied the conventions of combat. This was not a simple episode of battle. It was an act that transcended war, a gesture of humanity that rose above hatred and death. In an instant, those enemy pilots who were trained to kill chose to save. They decided to spare the life of the man who, under other circumstances, would have been their prey. What could drive an enemy to act with such compassion when the world around them is shattered and immersed in the worst of horrors? How did two men, burdened with the weight of a cruel war, manage to look beyond weapons and hostility, seeing the other not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a life to be preserved? This unimaginable act of mercy would cast a faint light on the war, reminding us that, even amid destruction, there are moments when humanity can be greater than the machinery of war. This is the beginning of a story that, over the years, would continue to touch hearts and challenge our perceptions of what it means to be human. The story of Ed Catrell and the two German pilots is a reminder that, even in the darkest times, compassion and solidarity can emerge from where we least expect it, and that the deepest acts of kindness can be found in the most unlikely places. Prepare yourself for a journey that is not just about war, but about what makes us truly human in the face of adversity. The story of mercy, courage, and compassion that you are about to hear is more than just a simple account of battle. It is a tribute to those who, even in times of hatred and destruction, chose to look beyond the war and offer life where others would have chosen death. It was the winter of 1944, and Europe was immersed in the whirlwind of a conflict that had already consumed millions of lives and turned entire landscapes into vast fields of destruction. The war, which had begun with promises of victory and glory, had now become a routine of endless losses, where hope seemed like an increasingly distant luxury. In December of that year, the German forces, though worn out and on the verge of collapse, were still determined to fight to the last man, the last bullet. The stage was set for what would be one of the most decisive and bloodiest offensives of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. The biting cold of the European winter enveloped soldiers and aviators in a dense and oppressive atmosphere. On the ground, American and German soldiers prepared for fierce combat in the forests of Belgium, while in the air, aircraft cut through the skies with the precision of deadly machines. In this tense atmosphere, with every passing minute, danger drew closer. The roar of fighter and bomber engines was a constant reminder that human life held little value in the face of the relentless military forces in action. For the pilots of the U.S. 9th Air Force, each mission was a game of risk, where survival depended on skill, luck, and the quickness to react to an ever-moving enemy. December 17, 1944, began like any other day, but the men of the 493rd Fighter Squadron, also known as the Grim Reapers, knew it would be different. The mission was clear: a low-altitude bombing attack on German forces trying to advance through the Ardennes and disrupt the Allied defensive line. Although the Allied air forces were in a position to support the ground units, the threat of German anti-aircraft defense, especially the feared flak and combat fighters, made every mission risky and unpredictable. However, the real tension lay in the preparation, in the psychological state of the aviators. It wasn't just about weapons and planes. It was about facing fear and emotional exhaustion. The 493rd pilots were used to daily combat. The deafening sounds of explosions and sharp turns to evade enemy fire were part of their lives, but not everyone coped in the same way. For some, the constant psychological pressure of flying on a suicide mission, where death seemed a constant companion, was almost unbearable. One such pilot was Lieutenant Art Summers, a USC football player who, despite his bravery, had begun to succumb to the psychological weight of the war. Art had already shown signs of exhaustion, and that morning, his comrades literally had to help him into the cockpit of his plane. He was on the brink of emotional collapse, but like many others in that war, he had little choice but to carry on, no matter how difficult it was. The mission ahead of them was a low-altitude precision bombing operation, a task requiring total concentration and skill. For pilots like Ed Catrell, the expectation was for a quick and lethal attack. He was flying alongside one of his best friends, Lieutenant Jim Watson, who, unlike Art Summers, was ready to face the challenge with full focus. Together, they formed a 4-aircraft formation under the leadership of Commander Stanley Latius. Their goal was to destroy one of the most important German strongholds, a bridge that, if left intact, would allow the Germans to maintain their advance over the Allied lines. But what they didn't know was that this routine mission would turn into one of the most extraordinary moments of their lives. As the planes took off, slicing through the gray sky with their metallic fuselages glinting in the faint winter daylight, the weight of the mission began to set in. Adrenaline coursed through their bodies, but the real battle was not just on the battlefield. It was in the minds of the pilots. The first hours of flight passed without incident, with the planes flying in tight formation like a single moving unit. But as they neared the front line, the atmosphere grew heavier, more intense. The sky seemed full of danger. The enemy wasn't far. It couldn't be otherwise. As the planes flew over the Belgian landscapes, the eyes of every pilot were alert to the slightest movement on the horizon, ready to detect any sign of imminent danger. Every second dragged on, laden with uncertainty. And it was in this climate of maximum tension, when every breath seemed heavier, that the unexpected happened. The battlefield's pretense became an inescapable reality. The fear, the adrenaline, the feeling of being hunted, all of it prepared them for what was to come. And then the worst happened. The pilots realized they were not alone in the sky. As they neared their attack mission, a group of enemy planes, the Luftwaffe's Mi-109 fighters, launched a coordinated attack. What seemed like a simple bombing mission suddenly turned into a brutal aerial combat. It was a planned ambush, a deadly trap. Ed Catrell's anxiety escalated even further when he realized the net was closing in. His plane was targeted. Time was running out. With the engines of our Mary roaring and the tension at its peak, Ed and his squadron mates' fate now rested in the hands of luck, skill, and courage. The only certainty was that in moments, the skies over Belgium would turn into a battlefield where death and mercy walked side by side. But what Ed didn't know yet was that, in the heart of this firestorm, a gesture would emerge that would defy all expectations of war. The sun was still low on the horizon when the Allied planes began to approach the front line. The aircraft of the 493rd Fighter Squadron, led by Stanley Latius, flew in tight formation, with each pilot in their position. Ed Catrell's heart was pounding as he looked at the landscape below, his eyes fixed on the horizon line where, on that fateful day, the skies would become the stage for one of the most intense combats of World War II. As the squadron advanced, the tension grew. The constant hum of their P-47 Thunderbolts engines was a familiar melody. But today, With the relentless buzz of flak slicing through the air, the sense of bracing for the unexpected was inescapable. The fear of being hit by the dreaded German anti-aircraft artillery batteries always lingered, but what Ed and his comrades didn't yet know was that the real danger would come not from the ground, but from the sky. The Me-109s, the indomitable Luftwaffe fighters, were lying in wait. The squadron was already flying over Belgium when the first sign of an enemy attack emerged. 20 German fighters, including Me-109s, burst through the clouds, cutting through the air at breakneck speed. In an instant, the calm of the flight turned into total chaos. The Allied squadron, until that moment focused on attacking their target, now found itself in a deadly dogfight. At first, Ed couldn't believe what he was seeing. 20 enemy planes closing in at high speed, splitting the skies into two fronts of fire. Every move had to be calculated with absolute precision. Danger was everywhere. Chaos took over the aerial battlefield. Commander Stanley Latias was the first to react, ordering a maneuver to confront the threat. The Allied fighters scattered, trying to reorganize to face the attack. Ed, flying his wingman to Lieutenant Jim Watson, prepared to enter the fight. The sky was ablaze, with the crackling of machine gun fire and the buzz of bullets tearing through the air. Me-109 at my 3 o'clock, Ed shouted over the radio, alerting his leader. The enemy was approaching rapidly, with the German planes trying to exploit gaps in the squadron's formation. Aerial combat wasn't just a battle of physical forces, but an intense psychological struggle. Every pilot knew that one distraction, one mistake, one wrong move could be fatal. Ed watched as Jim Watson, his leader, tried to maneuver out of the line of fire, but the moment he pulled up, the enemy struck him. An explosion tore through the sky, and Watson's plane was downed. Ed saw his leader get hit and instinctively pulled his aircraft away from enemy fire. The fight left no room for emotion, but a bitter feeling overwhelmed Ed as he watched his friend disappear into the clouds below. With his engine still running, though compromised, Ed tried to gain altitude, desperate to get out of the firing line of the German fighters. But the situation quickly worsened. Ed's P-47, our Mary, took a direct hit from a Me-109. The explosion rocked the plane, and a wave of heat filled the cockpit. Ed's vision was obscured by hot oil splattered across his window. His plane was severely damaged, and the feeling that everything could end at any moment intensified. I'm hit, Ed shouted, but there wasn't much he could do. The P-47's engine was failing, and the aircraft seemed to be dying slowly. The pressure was immense, and Ed's survival instincts were on high alert. He knew his sole objective now was to survive. But the most surprising moment was yet to come. Amid the confusion, two figures appeared in Ed's line of sight. Two Me-109s approached his aircraft, not to attack him, but to accompany him. Surprised, Ed looked at the enemy fighters and wondered if his eyes were deceiving him. The German pilots, realizing that Ed was incapable of fighting, began flying alongside his plane in an almost protective formation. They weren't there to kill, but to escort. The cruelty of war gave way to an unexpected moment of humanity in the midst of the hellish skies. Ed's situation seemed desperate, with the engine nearly out of operation and his P-47 descending slowly. But the two enemy pilots didn't fire. They stayed close, flying in formation, as if ensuring his safety until he reached Allied lines. A gesture of mercy amidst the chaos. Ed watched, astonished, at the enemy fighters beside him. These German pilots, who had likely shot down many Allied planes before, were now, inexplicably, giving him a chance to survive. As Ed neared the Allied lines, the two Me-109s began to pull away. With a simple hand gesture, a silent farewell, they turned back and flew toward enemy territory. For Ed, it was a miracle. He could hardly believe what had just happened. His eyes, though blurred by tension and hot oil, could still make out the Allied front line below, now within reach. With his aircraft almost adrift, Ed did what he could to maneuver his P-47 toward the ground, struggling to maintain control. The landing was a miracle in itself. His engine was failing, the fuel running out, and he had to make a forced landing, but Remarkably, he managed to touch down. When the mechanics ran to the plane, it was clear how severe the damage was. The engine had lost 8 cylinders out of 18, yet somehow the plane had still functioned. Ed, exhausted and with trembling hands, stepped out of the aircraft and, without thinking, kissed the ground. He had survived, but the battle in the skies and the unexpected actions of his enemies had left an indelible mark on his memory. That was the aerial confrontation of that day, a battle for survival where death and mercy intertwined in a moment of humanity in the midst of war. War, with all its violence and brutality, rarely offers space for the unexpected, for an act of kindness amidst the chaos. The logic of battle is cold and relentless. Kill or be killed. However, on that day in the skies above Belgium, a scene that defied all reason of the conflict was witnessed by Ed Catrell, a pilot of the United States Air Force, and by others who perhaps could never understand what really happened. After the devastating attack on the formation of P-47 Thunderbolts from the 493rd Fighter Squadron, Ed was in a desperate situation. His plane, the Armary, had been severely damaged. The engine failed every second, and the metallic sounds of the rumble coming from the fuselage and fuel system indicated that, in a short time, the plane would no longer be able to continue flying. His only option was to attempt an emergency landing before it was too late. The fear of falling into enemy territory, far from Allied lines, tormented his thoughts, but something surprising happened amidst the turmoil of the battle. While Ed tried with all his might to maintain control of his damaged aircraft, the radar picked up 2 points rapidly approaching his position. Initially, he thought they were more German fighters, perhaps the same E-109s that had attacked the squadron. Ed's instincts, honed by years of combat training, automatically kicked in, and he prepared for the fight, even though he knew he no longer had the strength to resist. However, the 2 planes were not coming to shoot. With the precision of predators, the enemy fighters approached Ed, but instead of opening fire, they formed a formation, as if they were escorting him. For a moment, Ed's mind couldn't comprehend what was happening. It was impossible that 2 Luftwaffe pilots, who had been responsible for so many deadly attacks against the Allies, were, at that moment, offering any kind of help. What Ed saw before him seemed like a miracle, a collision of completely opposite universes, where the brutality of war gave way to an act of unusual compassion. While he tried to keep his aircraft flying, with his heart racing and his sweaty hands struggling to hold the joystick, the 2 Me-109s followed him with precision. They didn't get too close, but they were there, in a symmetrical formation, as if ensuring that Ed wouldn't be attacked by other enemy fighters. Time seemed suspended. The heat of the battle had diminished, and a strange silence enveloped Ed. He observed the German planes around him, his brain still unable to process the complexity of the situation. The feeling of relief mixed with disbelief took over Ed. During the years of war, he had been trained to see the enemy as a constant threat, someone who was there to take his life at any moment. But what he was experiencing at that moment was the antithesis of that cruel reality. The unthinkable was happening before his eyes. War enemies, seemingly determined to allow his survival. Gradually, he realized that this was not a tactic, nor a calculated maneuver to lure the Allies into a trap. Those 2 German pilots, with their gleaming planes and their clearly survival-focused vision for Ed, were making an extraordinary decision. They were escorting him to ensure he could return to the Allied lines. There was no logical explanation for this act. It was the choice of 2 men, at the height of the conflict, who opted for a form of humanity that transcended the limits of war. Is this real? Ed thought, trying to process the gesture that, in his understanding, should be impossible. For a few moments, he felt almost immune to the chaos, as if, at that instant, the war had taken a pause. He found himself in the skies, surrounded by 2 enemy planes, but somehow feeling protected. But the truth of that mercy would be revealed when Ed, after a fierce struggle to control his plane and survive, finally approached the Allied lines. The gesture of the enemy pilots was not just a sign of compassion, but a testament that deep down, humanity can emerge even in the darkest moments. when least expected. Before they departed, the two German pilots performed one last maneuver, a kind of silent salute to Ed. Without saying a word, without even looking at each other, they slowly drifted away, turning towards the horizon, and returned to enemy territory. It was an unexpected farewell, but it spoke volumes about what had happened there. There were no shouts, no triumphs. There was only a silent understanding and mutual respect between two enemies who, for a brief moment, chose to preserve a life. For Ed, returning to the Allied lines was a true victory. When his plane touched down, the mechanics and soldiers rushing to help him had no idea what he had just experienced. Ed was physically exhausted, but inside him, something had changed forever. He had escaped death, but more than that, he had been touched by kindness in a setting where, for a long time, that seemed impossible. Ed's story and his experience with those German pilots, far from being just a simple war anecdote, was a reminder that, even in the most extreme situations, true humanity can manifest. The act of mercy by two enemies in the midst of the storm of war transcended any rational explanation. It was proof that, even in the bloodiest battlefields, the lines between life and death can be tenuous, and kindness, however unlikely, could reveal itself when the world needed it most. War had taken much from Ed, but in that moment, it had also given him something he would never forget. A reminder that, no matter how unthinkable it seemed, mercy could blossom even in the darkest places. The story of Ed Catrell and the German pilots who, in an unthinkable gesture, chose mercy, compels us to deeply reflect on the nature of humanity. In times of war, when violence and destruction take over the world, it is easy to fall into the trap of believing that war erases the noblest aspects of our existence. The brutality of war tends to create an abyss between men, transforming them into impersonal enemies, disconnected from their own stories, their families, and their aspirations. However, the story that Ed lived reminds us that, in all the darkest moments, the human spirit has the capacity to rise above hatred and violence. The decision of those German pilots to protect Ed and escort him to the Allied lines, instead of destroying him, is an exemplification of the complexity of the human being. It reveals that kindness, compassion, and empathy are not exclusive to one side or the other, regardless of the historical or ideological context. Instead of succumbing to the logic of kill or be killed, the pilots chose a response that defied expectations. They did not see Ed as an enemy to be defeated, but as a human in distress, worthy of protection. This act of mercy, amidst the chaos, makes us question to what extent we are capable of transcending the limitations imposed by circumstances and ideology. The true human nature, as this story shows us, is not limited by war or battle lines. It manifests in the choice to do good, even when the situation seems to demand the opposite. It is in this type of decision that we find the true essence of humanity, the ability to recognize in the other something that transcends the enemy, something that, even in times of violence, can connect with our own vulnerability and need for connection. History also leads us to think about the role of war in our lives. If on the one hand, war highlights the worst aspects of humanity, destruction, hatred, and intolerance, it also reveals something deeper, our capacity to change, to learn, to repent, and even to forgive. Even in times of conflict, we can still find moments of redemption, which, although fleeting, show that, at our core, we are all human. And that is exactly what makes the act of mercy by those pilots so significant. They, who were on the other side of the line of fire, had a choice: follow the logic of war or act with humanity. And they chose humanity. In a world where violence and war often dominate historical narratives, the story of Ed Catrell and the two German pilots stands out as a beacon of hope and humanity. It challenges us to rethink the concept of enemy and teaches us that, even in the most extreme situations, we can make choices that reflect compassion, kindness, and respect for human life. The gesture of those pilots, who in a moment of conflict chose mercy over destruction, serves as a reminder that, despite wars, ideologies, and conflicts, human beings never lose their ability to act with empathy. In the end, true victory is not measured by the number of battles won, but by the ability to find humanity amidst chaos, and even in the most unlikely circumstances, to choose life. The story of Ed and the German pilots is a story of redemption, of unexpected but deeply significant choices. It teaches us that, no matter how immersed we may be in adversity, there is always the possibility of an act of kindness, a choice of mercy, that can change the course of a life and, who knows, even our own worldview. The story narrated here is a tribute to the men and women who, in times of war, challenge the stigmas imposed by conflicts to act with courage, humanity, and integrity. Special thanks to the pilots of the United States Air Force and the soldiers who, in some way, showed that the true battle is not in the skies, but in the human heart. To the German pilots who, amidst the horrors of war, made the decision to save a life, and to all those who, like them, chose to be more than the enemy. This story is for you. May the world never forget that, even in war, compassion and mercy can prevail. Final thanks to all those who believe that, even in the darkest moments of history, there is room for light. This account is a reminder that ultimately, what defines us is not the conflicts we face, but the choices we make in the face of them.